Hades' art style is immediately recognizable. It is unique, stylized, and graphic. But what if Ahri from League of Legends was in the Hades game? But in order to design that, I first have to understand what makes Hades' art style unique. When we look at Hades' art style, there are a few things that stand out right away. First thing is line art, but also they use black for really dark shadows. But is that all? There's gotta be more to it. So let's take a look at the colors. Looking at the colors, we see that there's one or two main saturated colors and everything else is just muted. They use very desaturated colors for everything else. So looking at this one, for example, we can see really saturated red and some really saturated yellows. And then we see everything else is muted, like the skin and everything else. We see it again here with green and orange to be the saturated color and everything else is muted. But now let's see if it is this simple and if we can create Ahri in the Hades universe using these three simple rules. Like always, I started with a rough sketch, but this looks nothing like Hades' art style. So going back to the main points that we analyze, I know that line art is the first important thing. So I start drawing on top of the sketch with clean line art. I try to add as much detail as I can and avoid the rough, sketchy lines. Now that we have our line art complete, I need to start, thinking about light and shadow and start painting. But before I do that, I can start adding those really dark black colors in the darkest shadows. So I have to think about where's the light coming from. So I decided that light is coming from the front top. So I started adding the shadows in a layer on top of everything else. So no matter what I do, those black shadows will always be on top. So I added the blacks in the back areas, for example, of the character, and also where the cast shadows are, like under the neck or other areas, just like we see in the other Hades paintings or Hades designs. Now comes the decision about the colors. I have to think about what colors need to be saturated and what colors need to be muted. But which ones should I choose? It can't just be random. So looking at Ahri's design, we can say that the main colors are red and purple. So I chose those two to be my saturated colors. And then everything else, including the skin, should be muted. And I start adding all my flat colors on separate layers on the character. And everything here is under the line art layer and those black shadow layers. Now, when it comes to shading, here's the tricky part. There's no really soft shading or blending. I use a hard round brush with almost no opacity control at all and start shading. The difference between the local color, light, and shadow is very subtle. But just changing the value is not enough. I also add a bit of color variation. For example, for the skin, I move the light closer to the yellows and the shadows closer to the orange and red to give it a little bit more interest and a little bit more color variation. So I do the same thing with everything else. One of the things that I think is important to note is painting metal. So to do the gold part is important to have a lot of contrast. Now in this style, the contrast here is I use completely black in some areas and then very light in other areas. Then another important thing that gold and metals do that they really reflect the colors from the surrounding. So you can see me adding red and purple into the gold, and because gold is reflective and it reflects the things around it. And using that method and that type of thinking gives a more believable thing about gold and metal. Now, when I wanted to paint Ahri's magical ball here, I looked at some of the magical effects in Hades. You can see how simple they are, simple transitions between light and shadow and just shape language. They really emphasize the shape language and not so much the way they render it. So the same thing here, hard round brush again with a little bit more contrast this time between light and shadow. But I also try and soften the transition a bit. Painting magical effects like this is usually difficult for me, but I like the simplicity of the way this is done in this style. And I think it really worked. And one thing I think is important to note that every once in a while, I would want to make adjustments to the colors and painting, but I didn't want to repaint everything, so I would keep using the multiply and the overlay layer modes when I wanted to add more shadow or more light or even a little bit of color variation into what I have already painted. And I do that again and again, even at the end of the painting, I merge everything and I just create another 2 layers, one for multiply, one for overlay or hard light to add a little bit more shadow or add highlights, for example, and so on. Also, one thing that I notice in the Hades art style is that they add some extra line art or sketch lines within the character to imply things. For example, the collarbone or the neck, instead of rendering so much with different colors, they just add simple lines. And those simple lines really give the story and it matches the art style instead of spending so much time trying to render those. And here it is, imagining Ahri in the Hades games.
I know this place. Some part of me remembers.
The main thing about this art style is simplicity in rendering. And we tend to complicate things sometimes, but with studying this art style, I'll learn to make simple but intentional decisions in my rendering. Now, if you like this video, you can also watch my video where I analyze the art of Hollow Knight.